Yes, that's true. I'm running the oil and gas business of DNV. And of course, the topic of energy transition is very important to me and to DNV. And that is the reason we have produced now this energy transition outlook. And we have decided not to look at the scenario-based outlook. We are trying to forecast to the best of our knowledge and to decisions that have been made in the energy system. So why are we doing this in DNV? Most of you maybe know that we are a technical advisor to a lot of industries, but we see that 70 to 80% of our revenue comes from the energy sector, either being oil and gas, which I represent, or also the renewable sector. We're about 50-50 in those two sectors, but also the maritime or the transport sector. A lot of the business we are doing is about transportation of energy. So it's very important for our clients that we are on top of this topic so that we can give them the right advices, but it's also important for ourselves and the decisions that we need to do on our own strategy. So what we have done is to model the energy system using experts all around the world, modeling from the energy generation all the way to the use. Using a dynamic system, modeling probabilities and interdependencies, and also allowing us to do sensitivity analysis. Of course, there are elements of the energy systems that we know better than others, so in that sense, there are some strengths and weaknesses of our model, but we intend to update every year so that we, from, for example, debates such as this, can add on new knowledge into the model. So it's also been mentioned that the energy system, it depends a lot on geography, or where in the world are you, because it depends it depends on the geopolitics around the country, it depends on the energy source you have, it depends on the infrastructure that is already in place, which again decides the cost of doing a shift. So we have divided the world into 10, thank you, into 10 main geographies, and we see that the differences are quite significant. But what I will talk about now is the global one, the global energy transition. And my 3 takeaways, or what I hope you take away from this, is 3 elements. First of all, we forecast that there will be a peak in energy need for the world within the next 30 years, maybe even less than that. I will come back to why we forecast that. Secondly, as mentioned previously, gas will be the single most important energy source. And thirdly, even though there's a lot of positive developments in the energy sector, the path that we are on currently does not meet the Paris Agreement. We are on the track to a 2.5-degree scenario. And I will explain that as well. So let me start then with our forecast. Let's see if this works. Yeah. So this is how the energy supply looks today, and how we forecast it. So today, 80%, more than 80% actually, of our energy is fossil. And the transition we forecast is that towards 2050, it will be approximately half fossil and half non-fossil. So it's a significant shift. Breaking it down on the sources, we see the blue one to the bottom is coal, the green is oil, and the blue is gas. Those are the main elements, 80% today. We see that what we forecast is that the peak for coal has actually already passed, and that the peak for oil demand will come in about 10 years' time, while the peak for gas has still not arrived. It will come in about 2030, where it will increase, and then towards the mid-century, go towards approximately the same level as today. So we predict that the oil and gas contribution to the energy sector will be about 43% in 2050, and it's a little more than 50 today, oil and gas. So, looking at the demand and which sector needs the most of the energy, roughly we can split in three. It's transportation, it's buildings, and it's manufacturing. And then there's about 15% that is non-energy use, which is feedstock for fertilizers, plastic, clothes, carpets, things like that. And even though the demand within these sectors look quite stable going forward, I think we all know and feel that there are big changes within each sector. We see that, especially here in Norway, we've seen how the electrical car changes the transport sector. There is more to come, maybe on the transport sector. We talked about electrical truck, we talked about gas fuel trucks, we talked about autonomous cars, about car sharing. All these things affect energy uses. Similar in the building, we see more use of insulation, more use of LED technology, which stabilizes the use going forward. And also in manufacturing, we see increased use of optimization, robotics, hybrid energy solutions, so that you can run engines more optimum, for example, is also important elements of this. So we forecast that the demand will stabilize going forward. A lot to do with the technology development that is happening. But one thing is the demand, and another thing is the supply, because there is more energy needed to fill a demand, because there's energy loss also in the energy production. And this is what is maybe the most surprising of our forecast, is that we see that the peak for energy will reach in about 2030. And that is also because of the efficiency in the energy production. For example, coal to electricity is a 35% efficiency, or a 35% transformation. Gas to electricity, 60%. If we move now towards renewables, we know that the amount of energy needed to build and install power and solar is tiny compared to the energy generation we get over a lifetime. So the main point here, and the reason we see a peak in energy, is that the world is going more toward electrification. That is the main thing. But the peak in energy need is one of the findings in our forecast. So does that mean that we don't believe in or see economic growth? Well, we do see economic growth. We see that toward 2050 there will be about 130% growth in GDP. So maybe slower, a little bit slower than some other forecasts. A reason for that is we think that India and China is not growing as fast as some previous forecasts, also because they are moving more towards the service sector. But again, one thing is the growth in GDP, the other is the increased energy efficiency. So to put it simple, what we have calculated is that 1 megajoule of energy in 2015 can generate 14 cents of GDP. In 2050, that same energy amount can produce 34% of GDP. And this is a big energy efficiency, which decouples. It will decouple economic growth with energy use and also CO2 emissions. So, as I said, the reason is electrification and efficiency going forward. And today, the electricity sector counts for 18% of the energy carrier capacity. 18%. And remember, this is globally, not like this in Norway. This is globally. Going toward 2050, the electricity sector will account for 40% of the energy by energy carrier. Coal is decreasing, but natural gas is also, of course, important part of this. Where does all this electricity come from? There has been significant development in the renewable sector. The cost has reduced enormously, much faster than earlier forecasts. We call it the cost learning curve of 20%, meaning that every time the capacity is doubled, the costs have reduced 20%. And this slide shows that in 2050, we think that out of the 40% that is electricity, 35 is from PV, and approximately the same amount from wind, offshore wind and onshore wind. That's the main development and the main driver for the electrification and the energy efficiency. Towards 2050, we forecast that the uptake of solar will be 80-fold compared to now, and wind will be 30-fold. And we see that countries, of course, such as China and India are really driving this, and India even more. And we forecast that India will surpass China within this forecasting period. India is very interesting. I was in India just 2 weeks ago, and I was fortunate to talk to the energy advisor to the Prime Minister. And he said that, of course, India is going renewable, but that's in the longer term. They have a current issue now which is related to air pollution. Air pollution in bigger cities in India is terrible, and it's not acceptable for the government, even for the population, to have an air quality such as that. So they have decided now to ban new coal-fired plants and to increase their import of gas. Of course, this is possible now, where gas has become a more commoditized energy source, but it also shows that there are several drivers in the energy transformation. It's also about air quality. It's about having a time outlook, what needs to be done now and what will happen more in the future. So they are increasing their import capacity. Again, that means they have to invest a lot in their gas infrastructure, but they see that they need to do this in order to give the population a good quality of life. Okay, so renewables, important. This energy transition, how can we afford that? We have calculated that today we use 5% of GDP on energy. Going forward towards a more renewable future, this amount is 3%. Of course, it's 3% of a bigger number, but still, the world as a whole, we will spend less money on energy than we do today, which means that there is funds, there is money available to do this energy transition. And coming then to my third point, where is the world heading? No, we are not reaching the Paris Agreement with today's effort. There is more that needs to be done, but this slide shows that there are funds available and it should be possible. We will exceed the carbon budget by 2041 if we continue on this track.
So, Liv, can we bring in the
Yes.
expert group? Do you mind if we just open it up now?
Fine.
Are you kind of almost at the end?
I'm at the end.
Great, excellent, good timing. So who'd like to kick off the conversation? I mean, is it realistic that the costs as a percentage of the total will go down? That seems a little optimistic to me, but hey, what do I know? Volker Krij knows a whole lot more than I do. Volker from EASA, what's your question?
Yeah, thanks for this very interesting presentation. I was wondering, in the previous presentation or in the discussion after that, we've heard that the IEA has notoriously underestimated the growth of renewables over the past decade or so. I'm wondering whether there is a risk that now, given this absolutely stunning growth over the past 10 years or so, we are just extrapolating this trend and becoming over-optimistic. Do you see this risk? I mean, if you go back historically to the literature of energy projections from the 60s and 70s, when nuclear was in its infancy, the idea was there would only be nuclear by now. So I'm just wondering whether there is also a possibility that we are hyping what we have seen over the past 10 years or so.
Yeah, well, it depends on the perspective. But if you remember my first slide where I say that actually 50% almost of energy will continue to be fossil, has to balance the renewables. So I don't think we underestimate or overestimate the uptake of renewables. And I also think that there is some other important drivers. I mean, there are countries that can jump some steps also with respect to infrastructure. That's also kind of driving a lot of investment and also willingness to do this energy transition. And I don't think we overestimate.
And then the air quality arguments are a further propellant, I guess. Robert Ritz.
Yes, thank you very much. That was a fascinating sort of talk at the global level. So you've sort of teed up a question. You mentioned that you have a breakdown into 2 regions, and I wondered if you could say a little bit more about who the leaders and the laggards are at the regional level.
Yes, so the different regions are Americas, Europe, Sub-Saharan, Middle East, Russia, India and the subcontinent there, and China. So, of course, if you go to the Middle East, there's a lot of sun there, but there's also a lot of gas, and there's a lot of competitive gas. So is there one place that will be still heavily reliant on fossil? It will be the countries that have the sources and have the gas. The energy market is, of course, will be price sensitive, and those regions that have cheap access to gas will be different from, for example, sub-Saharan Africa, which will maybe rely more on the solar.
Question from the audience? A forest of arms goes up in front of me? No? Well, come on. We've got a question coming up from a professor from NTNU who's going to rescue you. But the next one is going to be in the audience. Ah, great. First, Knut Murk from NTNU is going to put his question, and then we have one from here, a hero.
Is this mic working? Yeah. I think it's very nice to hear a forecast as a break from the scenarios. The scenario building can give you the impression that we're living in a science fiction world where there's a world government that decides everything, and of course we're not. And that leads me to my question to you too. Forecasting from the world order that we have had is one thing, and in many ways I suppose that's what you have to do. But do you have any thoughts about the concerns that are rising these days about the world order being disrupted by an entirely new kind of politics in the United States, in China, where you're going from one party to one man rule, Russia, or other disruptive technologies like drones, flying cars, or Bitcoin mining. Is Bitcoin mining in your forecast?
So I love your question, because that also is the answer to why I think this is the most fascinating theme, right, today, energy transition. Bitcoin is not part of this forecast, but we're looking into that, how, for example, buying and selling small amount of energy can be facilitated by Bitcoin technologies. But that's, since we are forecasting, we are not baking things, anticipations into our forecast. But that's part of our research going forward now, how soon will these opportunities become factual and can be modeled. Energy security is a big question. It's not modeled into our forecast. We have based actually I didn't mention that, but it's on the cost of the energy. But energy security is extremely interesting. We see US now becoming energy independent. We see the discussions in Europe being depending on Russia or not. Of course, in India I mentioned, will they? There is big gas supplies. They don't have gas themselves, but they need to import. The easiest thing would be to import from the Middle East through a pipeline, but the geopolitics makes that very difficult. So yeah, many different perspectives there, and impossible to discuss on a general basis, I think.
So can I ask a follow-up on that, which really draws together the point that Volker Krei was making, which is that there's always a tendency to overcompensate for what's just happened, for where we are, and the point that Professor Murk made, which is about how do you put in the unknown unknowns into your models when you're making these long-term things? How do you kind of factor in the disruptors, since we don't really know how to evaluate them, but you do have to put them in there somewhere, in some way.
Yeah, but that's the point.
It's a question for all of you modelers, really.
So we try not to be opinionated in the model. So we have modeled the dynamics with probabilities, and we have sensitivities to test the robustness. And of course, that will be refined and improved as we go along. And then, of course, there's opinions, such as things that I say now, which are not in the model, but it's more commenting on what the facts look like today.
Right. Maybe we can talk about modeling in the course of the day, if anyone's remotely interested in that. There was someone here who wanted to ask a question. Hold it up quite close to your mouth.
Joe Smithett from Statoil. I was intrigued by the amount of renewables that you put into the model. Right now we're seeing a large growth in renewables, which are kind of varying production, but we see them as a kind of an add-on to the big centralized energy production facilities. If we're going to include such a portion of renewables, we also need to take into account that they are varying. The sun is only shining in the day and so on. Have you done any considerations of how we're going to compensate for that in these scenarios?
Yeah, and that's why storage is important. And that's why also gas will have such a large importance going forward to actually balance this intermittency, which is a big thing, of course. So there has to be a balance. And gas is what we have, what we see is what goes hand in hand.
But not everyone in the room may agree on that, so we will push that point a bit more and probe it a bit more in the panel discussion to come. Liv, for now, thank you very much. Let's show our appreciation to Liv Hovem.